Welcome everyone to the Bard Spotlight featuring Bard. The Bard. He's Bard. In this video, we're going to go ahead and attempt to deconstruct the most convoluted passive in the entire game. Traveler's Call. That is Bard's passive. So Bard's passive can ultimately be split up into two separate passives. One focusing on chimes and the other focusing on meeps. Now, they have a little bit of interaction with each other, but for the purpose of this guide, we're going to look at them separately. Okay, so first let's take a look at the chimes aspect of the passive. What this passive does is periodically spawns these immobile chimes around the map that only Bard can interact with. When he passes over the chimes, he picks them up. He's granted a stacking movement speed buff up to 5, and it only works out of combat. He gets a little bit of experience, and he gets mana. Let's start off by explaining some examples of how you don't want to use Bard's Chime passive. Right off the bat, you may be tempted to go and collect every single chime that you see on the map. After 5 minutes, however, some of your chimes are going to start spawning in the enemy jungle. At this point, overextending yourself too far to get 1 or 2 chimes is not a good idea. The reward you get from collecting a chime or two is simply not worth the risk of putting yourself in bad positions like that. Now, in the same vein, Bard players will often focus really hard on nearby chimes and drop whatever they're in the process of doing to go and collect them. Now, this can often be seen as a huge mistake for multiple reasons. So Bard is a massive lane bully in the early stages of the game. With his high damage training abilities and his sustaining tools, Bard's able to apply a lot of pressure. But by leaving your lane to go collect these chimes, depending on how far away they are, you suddenly lose a lot of the pressure you may have mounted up to this point. And, more importantly, you'll often leave your AD carry defenseless without realizing how hard they may be punished as a result of you leaving. Lastly, and this one's a little bit more subtle, but in the early stages of the game, you should almost never pick up any chimes if you are at full mana. So as I mentioned briefly, picking up chimes grants Bard mana. Well, it's actually quite a substantial chunk of it too. It's 12% of your max. And thus, these chimes actually act as a very important mana sustaining tool for the early game. Bard's abilities, particularly his sustaining ability, W, cost large amounts of mana. But if you're able to use the mana sustain from your chimes efficiently, Bard is able to cast his high cost abilities much more liberally, making his early game that much stronger than it would already be. Okay, so now let's talk about how to take this passive to its full potential. I should mention that chimes spawn in a certain range around Bard that grows larger as the game time progresses, meaning that in the early game, chimes are going to be spawning pretty close to wherever Bard is, so the bot lane, assuming you stay there. And later on into the game, chimes are going to be spawning all over the map regardless of where you are or where you've been. So knowing that it's actually possible and extremely beneficial to manipulate the first couple of chime spawn locations, specifically the first 2. Now let me explain. After the game starts, 2 chimes will spawn at exactly 35 seconds. You want these chimes to be as close to your lane as possible. So, immediately after the fountain gates open, you want to path directly to your bottom lane tower. Not mid, not through the jungle, directly to your tower. This will guarantee that these first 2 chime spawns are going to be relatively close to Bard, and thus close to the bot lane, rather than anywhere else on the map. Now, a third chime is going to spawn on the map at 1 minute and 25 seconds. To ensure good placement for this chime, you can stand in one of the bottom lane bushes, and don't worry about not having time to make it back to the Krugs or the Gromp camp. It takes less than 15 seconds to walk back there. So, if everything went well, you'll now have 3 chimes that are close to your lane. Don't pick these chimes up. While it seems like a good idea, because it means that you'll hit level 2 before everyone else in your lane, the problem with this is that Bard's level 2 abilities, his W and his E, don't actually grant him any more strength in all-in fights, and thus they don't add any pressure to the lane. And because of this, you actually want to save your chimes for more important reasons, like when you need mana or if you want to get somewhere on the map quickly with the mobility that they give you. So I really want to stress the importance of this idea of leaving chimes up. Something I didn't mention earlier is that chimes will actually stay on the map for 10 minutes before they disappear. This means that you don't have to be in any rush to collect them for fear of not being able to get them later in the game. Now, as I also mentioned earlier, you'll often see Bard players focus too hard on picking chimes up just for the sole purpose of picking them up. What they don't understand is that chimes actually provide a huge immediate benefit like the mana and mobility that they give. After those two first intervals of chime spawns, it's not realistic to try to manipulate the rest, because obviously you're going to be focusing on your lane. While you're laning, however, chimes are going to tend to spawn in close proximity to each other because of the fact that you're simply in the same spot for a long time. Now, it's important to notice when your chimes are neatly clumped up like this, because it means that your little excursions to go collect chimes are going to be much more efficient. Without taking much more time, you can quickly collect 2 or 3 chimes and return to lane in the same amount of time that you would have taken to collect 1. Alternatively, instead of returning to lane, you can use these stacks of movement speed to augment your roaming potential, which you can then use to either gank a lane or secure map control and vision. Knowing all of this information about chimes, it becomes clear that the strength of this part of the passive is solely dependent on your decision-making abilities. Deciding when and when not to use these clumps of chimes for roaming will ultimately determine how much of an impact you may have on the rest of the map. But it may also spell the demise of your AD carry if you leave them alone for extended periods of time. Finding the perfect times to roam is objectively impossible, as there are way too many factors that affect the decision. But after playing Bard and having the experience firsthand, you'll start to see more opportunities where the advantages of leaving your lane may outweigh the disadvantages. Now, there are a couple of factors that are the most important when considering your lane or leaving your lane to collect these chimes. If your AD carry has short range and will not be able to get any last hits while you're gone, it'll be very detrimental to your lane when you leave. Also, if your NA support has very high engage potential or tower diving potential, think of Alistar or Leona, you almost never want to leave your AD carry alone in 2v1 situations, as they'll be punished almost every time. One more thing to consider is that you almost never want to stray too far away from your bot lane if you aren't able to utilize the movement speed of at least 2 to 3 chimes. So think about it, roaming ability is directly linked to movement speed. Being faster means that you'll be able to more quickly react to anything that happens around the vicinity, and it also determines how fast you're going to be able to return to your lane if all else fails. This minimizes the time away from your lane and thus minimizes the risk of leaving your AD carry alone. Finally, let's take a look at the Meeps side of things. So Meeps are much more straightforward than the Chimes side of the passive. Essentially, Bard's auto attack consumes a Meep that will deal bonus amounts of damage. The Meeps have a cooldown and they'll slow enemies on hit. Now, this part of Bard's passive makes him an absolute monster during the early laning phase. The Meep-empowered auto attacks are going to use 2 procs of your Spell Thieves and contribute 2 instances of damage towards Thunderlords, which is undeniably the best mastery to use. Now, there isn't much to consider when analyzing this part of Bard's passive. At its core, it is a large damage boost to Bard's auto attacks, which simply emphasizes the importance of auto-attacking in trades and skirmishes, even though you're support. This extra bit of burst should not be underestimated and becomes relevant if low health targets are in range of a simple flash auto-attack while they're trying to escape. In the early game, make sure you always have a Meep ready before you go into a trade, which is why you should try to not use your Meeps on the creep wave, unless you're desperate to push. Later on in the game, don't forget to consider that your Meep-empowered auto attacks will slow, meaning that auto-attacking a target first will make it much easier to follow up with other skill shots from you or your team. Now, this has been a condensed version of all my thoughts on Bard's passive. I've played a ton of Bard, so I have a huge amount of ideas and things to say about Bard and each one of his spells. And so I intend to do similar videos like this, but for each of his spells individually. Let me know what you guys liked about this video, what I can improve for future ones. But most importantly, thank you all for watching, and I hope you learned some important Bard knowledge.